Good morning. Bonjour. My name is Jennifer Ditchburn. I'm the President and CEO of the Institute for Research on Public Policy. I want to acknowledge we're holding this news conference today from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. We recognize the Algonquin people's enduring presence and their role as caretakers of this land. All of us remember what happened 4 years ago this week. That's when everything stopped. Work, schools, stores, childcare, our day-to-day social connections. Many Canadians lost loved ones. Many Canadians are still sick from COVID-19. Many Canadians are still trying to keep their businesses afloat. I think all of us hope that our governments learned lessons, key lessons, from the COVID-19 crisis. But the reality in Canada is that we still have only a fragmented picture of what happened. The provinces, territories, and federal government are only looking at their separate pieces of the puzzle. Today, we released the first major report to look at how COVID-19 impacted Canadian institutions of public health, federalism, public service, and democracy across the country, not just in a single department or jurisdiction. Still, we're urging the federal government to go further than we could. It should appoint an independent expert panel to do a thorough examination of how our institutions performed during the biggest public health emergency of the last 100 years. Aujourd'hui, nous avons publié le premier rapport important qui examine l'impact du COVID-19 sur les principales institutions canadiennes dans l'ensemble du pays, et pas seulement dans un seul ministère ou une seule juridiction. Nous demandons fortement au gouvernement fédéral d'aller plus loin que nous n'avons pu le faire. Il devrait nommer un groupe d'experts indépendants chargé de procéder à un examen approfondi de la manière dont nos institutions se sont comportées pendant la plus grande urgence de santé publique des 100 dernières années. This expert panel should hear from key players in the provinces, territories, Indigenous communities, and cities to really get to the bottom of what happened. It should hear from people who worked at the community level to understand how decisions and messages during COVID-19 filtered down to everyday lives.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good morning. My name is David McLaughlin. I'm the President and CEO of the Institute on Governance. Bonjour, je m'appelle David McLaughlin. Je suis le Président chef de direction de l'Institut sur la gouvernance. An unprecedented pandemic required unprecedented responses. That's what our public servants did at all levels of government across the country. They stepped up to keep the country running and provided innovative, agile solutions with new programs and services. But individual public service sacrifice is no substitute for strong, resilient public institutions that work in the first place. The fact is that from emergency preparedness to IT to service delivery, governments were not ready for what was needed. A key lesson, therefore, in our report is that we cannot take institutional capacity for granted. So we outline how the pandemic exposed serious weaknesses in our institutions that affected government responses and public health outcomes. Every government had to create new systems and processes, new forms of governance to combat the pandemic. Good innovations should be kept. Now is the time to understand what processes and structures worked during the pandemic and not snap back to business as usual now that the pandemic is over. Our public servants are only as effective as the tools they have to work with. The pandemic exposed weaknesses in the physical and technological infrastructure that powers the service delivery systems that serve Canadians. While there were innovative workarounds during the pandemic, the underlying IT systems are aging fast and need to be upgraded. Our report recommends the federal government should appoint a respected outside expert to undertake a thorough review of our IT systems and the decision-making around how they are used. With those recommendations in hand, there should be a minister and a chief digital officer who are truly empowered by the Prime Minister with clear responsibility and accountability to bring changes across government. Les institutions résilientes nécessitent des fonctionnaires résilients. La pandémie nous a montré la valeur de l'innovation et de la prise de risques au sein des services publics. Pourtant, notre culture de la fonction publique est trop souvent réfractaire au risque, à un moment où une pensée audacieuse, innovante et agile est nécessaire. For Canada to confront and succeed in today's uncertain world of wars, national security, climate change, social and economic dislocation, and the inevitable next pandemic, we need public servant leaders with the skills to advise and implement solutions that work. And we need them to work in a renewed public service that has learned from the pandemic experience.
Thank you, David. Bonjour, Charles Breton, je suis le directeur du Centre d'excellence sur la Fédération canadienne. La confiance du public envers les institutions est un thème majeur dans notre rapport. Les institutions publiques ne peuvent pas fonctionner sans la confiance de la population et nous l'avons en partie perdue pendant la pandémie. Le rapport que nous publions aujourd'hui est basé sur ce que nous avons entendu lors d'une conférence en juin dernier au cours de laquelle nous avons réuni des décideurs, des élus, des hauts fonctionnaires, des représentants de la société civile de tout le Canada qui occupaient des postes clés durant la pandémie. En écoutant les récits de ce qui s'est passé pendant la pandémie, il est apparu clair qu'il existe un fossé entre les gouvernements et les personnes qu'ils essaient de rejoindre et de servir. Au sein des communautés, les gens se sont mobilisés de façon remarquable pour faire passer le message de la sécurité, de la vaccination. Mais on ne peut se préparer à des crises en comptant sur l'initiative individuelle et l'héroïsme ordinaire des gens pour compenser le manque d'appui des gouvernements. L'un des meilleurs moyens pour les gouvernements de se préparer aux prochaines crises majeures est d'établir à l'avance des relations significatives avec ces groupes communautaires. Sur le plan des relations entre les gouvernements, les villes doivent être consultées plus étroitement et on doit trouver une façon de les intégrer systématiquement aux réunions et aux forums intergouvernementaux qui les concernent. Quant à eux, les gouvernements autochtones doivent être traités comme ce qu'ils sont, c'est-à-dire de véritables gouvernements. Au cours de la pandémie, l'inclusion de ceux-ci dans les prises de décision se faisait souvent tardivement, elle variait d'un contexte à l'autre et était plus ponctuelle que délibérée et durable. Il est temps donc d'aller de l'avant. Encore une fois, on le dit souvent, dans le co-développement et la formalisation des relations avec les gouvernements autochtones. Mais même avec de meilleures relations et une meilleure collaboration, nous vivons dans un environnement où des acteurs mal intentionnés érodent la confiance et diffusent des informations erronées. Les gouvernements doivent créer un groupe de travail pan-canadien sur la désinformation afin de partager des données sur ce qui détermine la vulnérabilité à la désinformation, sur ses sources et sur les moyens dont disposent les gouvernements pour lutter contre ce problème. We're only scratching the surface with our report. That is why many of our recommendations call for more to be done. We all want to put the pandemic behind us, but our governments should not. Après 4 ans, je pense qu'on veut tous mettre la pandémie derrière nous, mais ce que nous disons, c'est que les gouvernements ne devraient pas le faire. Learning from what worked and from what did not will help our public institutions become more resilient, so they are ready for future challenges. So we need a systematic examination of how our institutions perform during the most demanding public health emergency of our time. We welcome your questions in English et en français.
I was sort of curious about the scale and scope and cost of how you see this, and you've sort of outlined an IT piece and an overall piece, and I think there's talk about panel for is it a panel for misinformation? Task force on misinformation. How do you see this unfolding? Is it hearings across the country, and are those 3 separate initiatives?
I can start. So they are 3 different things that we're suggesting. So I guess one of our key recommendations is for a broad-based examination that the federal government would trigger that would incorporate the territories, the provinces, the cities, Indigenous communities and nations, and civil society in a public way, in a collaborative way, in a more complete way that we've seen to date. Our report goes into detail on all the reports that have happened across the country, and there are many, but none of them actually look at how it all intersects. And that, I think, is where we really need to dig down. That's where we determined that there needed to be a lot more work to see, hey, all this great work was done. There was some real, real victories during pandemic, but then we also saw many weaknesses in terms of how governments work together. So we feel the federal government, its convening power and its access to data and so on, could be that rassembleur, the organization that brings everyone together. In terms of the other processes that we're recommending, one would be a task force that the provinces, territories, and federal government bring together on misinformation and disinformation to share data and best practices. That's a discrete, separate process. I'll let David talk about a review inside the Federal Public Service on IT systems, which we think is also something important that should happen, but distinct from the larger examination of COVID-19.
And is the overall goal to make, Canada better prepared for another health emergency, or is this all about improving government at all levels?
It's actually about improving government at all levels. So we're not, yes, sorry, go ahead. That's right. We're not suggesting that we need to go back and look at every health decision, how it was made, what was behind it, et cetera, and do some kind of blame and shame thing. It's not the purpose of this. It is truly about lessons learned so we can all be better prepared for the role of government to be better at serving Canadians in any number of challenges. So we're not just limiting ourselves to the pandemic, but surely, it affects public health. It's critically important. So yes, there are some things that we should absolutely learn from that. But I can tell you from my own role at the time during the pandemic as clerk of the Executive Council and Cabinet Secretary in Manitoba, where I was in charge of broad-based coordination of the COVID response, it was bigger than just public health. The issues that we had to deal with and the need to mobilize across government, across all of our institutions and processes to deliver on everything from worker support to business support to how do we keep our schools opening and all the rest of it. This is a whole of government approach. And so if we truly want to do a lessons learned examination, as we suggest, it should not just be confined to public health, but as obviously a key part of it. In the case of the IT piece, the IT situation, we heard very clearly during our conference just how complicated and difficult it was for public servants to roll out new programs, new benefit programs for Canadians with antiquated, old-style IT systems. I mean, they worked, but it was a hard slog in many respects. And I think this is an important learning for people. We should not take that infrastructure underneath for granted. When we come to a situation where the code, the actual coding for giving out OAS checks is as old almost as being eligible to receive OAS itself with COBOL code and everything, it should tell us something there. And so as we looked at this, that's why we parsed it into three kinds of these particular examinations. They are different, and we don't want to burden one examination with all of these issues. We can proceed as a country on all three, but we clearly, the lessons learned, the broader lessons learned examination is the big piece of this. But let's not wait to get going and fixing our IT systems. And when it comes to disinformation, we know it's there, and it's stronger and more acute post-COVID. So this is something that's not just the federal government, this is for all governments, and we are very clear about this because it affects everybody where they live and the role of government there. So that's the logic, Catherine, behind how we came to this conclusion, but it's very much listening to the folks on the ground and the people who are involved in that decision-making who suggested this is the kind of steps that we should take.
Mike LaPointe, Hill Times. I want to ask about the behavioral side of things in terms of the messaging around lockdowns, vaccines. We all remember how confusing things were in those early months and, up to a year and 2 years after that. Can you expand a little bit on some of the research that you've done and some of the recommendations around how that behavioral messaging from governments at all three levels can be adapted?
Yes, of course. So I think that's another message that we got during the conference. There's two pieces to that, to the messaging here. I think there is clarification over governance, over who should speak, right? And that's one piece that when anyone who looks back on the pandemic should look at who should speak on X, Y, Z, and that has to be clear because sometimes the messages were conflicting. So that's one thing. But on the behavioral side, I think the one thing that's important, again, is not to look back on COVID necessarily, but think about uncertainty, right? How do we communicate uncertainty? That was one problem with COVID, and it's one problem with all the other crises we'll face, right? Whether it's climate change, whether it's war abroad and their impact on domestic policies here, there is uncertainty. So how do you talk to people about uncertainty? There's a part where you need to be clear about it, so transparent about it. People can receive it. But we also need to talk about and work on how to better communicate that uncertainty. And so there's work that's being done, and we know that there are parts, especially in the federal government, like the Impact Canada does work on things like that and on behavioral sciences. We think that provinces should also get on that train, and that what is the research that's done at one level should be shared across all levels, right? And it's the same with disinformation. Like, we know that the federal government is doing a lot of work on this, but the people who are faced with disinformation the most, municipalities, people on the ground, they don't have access to that research. So that's why we're talking about that task force. So that research that's being done at the federal level trickles down to the people who are actually facing that disinformation day in and day out in the work that they do. So.
And just a quick follow-up on that. I've written about trust levels in government, and they were at an all-time high at one point early on in the pandemic, and it's slowly declined. I think there's a new poll today. And so is that what you just talked about, is that part of rebuilding some of that resiliency around trust that is kind of at risk right now?
Yeah, and I think that's one big part of the report as well, is we're saying a lot of this work has not been done. Looking back on like governance structure during the pandemic, those structures that were created to respond, looking at what worked and what didn't, a lot of that work has not been done. And if it's been done, some of it is not even public. And what we're saying is it should be public. People should know, and you should be transparent about it. They should know that you're doing this work. That will help restore trust. And if you haven't done that work, if you look at the report, again, we list some provinces have published one single Auditor General report on their response to the pandemic. That's not enough work. Maybe it is, and it's behind the scene, but we need to know about it. People need to know that you've done the work if you want to restore that trust that was lost.
Well, another little public service question. Service delivery is seen as a weakness, certainly in the federal government and at other levels, certainly exposed by the pandemic. Is the heart of the problem with service delivery an IT thing? And I just wonder how interested was government going to be in investing in IT or public servants taking big risks after things like ArriveCan and
IT, the issue related to IT is, to me, it's sort of threefold. One, it's the infrastructure itself. If you just take a factual, empirical look at the infrastructure itself, it needs to be refreshed, renewed, and replaced. We need to give our public servants the tools to do, to do the job. The second part is how that IT is used within the public service itself, within government. We should not assume government is monolithic, homogenous, and that there's lots of different systems across. They need to talk with each other. They need to engage with each other to provide information for evidence-based decision-making, for good policies, good outcomes that the governments, we want them to make on our behalf. But the service delivery side is really where the rubber hits the road. The federal government, except in a few areas, does not really have a public service culture that privileges service delivery to the same degree as provincial governments, municipal governments, which are closer to people under our system of federalism. So, but at the same time, we saw both during the pandemic and certainly as we came out of the pandemic, where there were big gaps in service delivery with passports or airports or things like that. And we know also from the conversation we had at the conference about how difficult it was to get the CERB program up and running in the system we have. So we took all that on board and thought about it, and it really is a call for action to say, look, we know this is the case, so don't delay, don't wait to just think about this. And sometimes we're pointing at a very clear problem that was also identified for us by senior public servants and others, elected officials, who worked within that. I get that there aren't a lot of votes for giving money and resources to public servants, but this is about public services. This is about Canadians getting the services they need. And if we do not give our public servants the kinds of tools, the kind of infrastructure, and the training and skills to go with it, such as navigating through risk and uncertainty, as Charles was talking about, we will pay for that. We pay for that as Canadians, as citizens. We pay for that in poorer outcomes. We pay for that in inefficient services, and we pay for that in higher costs. So there is a broader need here that we are pointing out, and so it is it's a learning we got from the conference. It's a learning that I went through in terms of in my experience on COVID, building dashboards, getting information for decision makers to make the right decisions so we can maintain trust. Those kinds of, these things are all interrelated. And that's why it was important for us as two organizations to come together and say, look, we need a conversation about this. And so we brought some very interesting people together who lived this experience and shared that experience. And we're grateful to them for that. And now we want to share the learnings that we have with some very specific recommendations that we hope will kickstart a needed second conversation in a post-pandemic world. We can't just turn the page on this as much as we all want to, right? As we all understand that. It's a very natural human reaction. But we need to learn as governments, we need to learn as Canadians what worked, what didn't work, and make those improvements within our public services, within our institutions, so they work the way that we as Canadians want them to, and what we pay for through through our taxes and other things. So it's part of a bargain that in a way that we have to make between governments and citizens, again, renew that, and for trust and good public service delivery.
Are you worried at all about a RiveCan hangover on the digital agenda?
I'm personally, no, I'm not, because that is a distinct situation, and that that we're seeing hearings, or having hearings on the government. Parliament is doing its job, frankly, trying to get to the bottom of this and find out what happened. We say in our report, and I said here, public servants stepped up. Most public servants, the vast majority of public servants, stepped up during the pandemic to deliver for Canadians in a public health emergency. We recognize that, and we need to underline that. But we can't live in a public health emergency all the time, so we draw some lessons. We need to draw lessons from that and make the improvements, underneath. In my view, it would be a shame that one episode that happened here, that we need to get to the bottom of, that Canadians want to get to the bottom of, the Parliament wants to get to the bottom of, and they should, that should somehow color the broader lessons here of what we are talking about, which affects the country as a whole.
Questions? We'll now take questions from Zoom. Fraser Needham, one question, one follow-up.
Hi, Fraser Needham from APN News. I just had a question about the feedback you got on the report, and what are some of the recommendations with rules with it to something that another sandwich like this?
Couldn't quite hear it.
It looked too garbled to hear.
I'm just wondering what the feedback you got from Indigenous groups was on the report, and what might improve things.
Hi, Fraser. Well, we're going to be very interested to hear feedback from Indigenous partners. We did have Indigenous participation in our conference last June. I can't tell you exactly what was said because it was under the Chatham House rule, which means that people were speaking openly but without it being put on the record. You can find in the back of our report everybody who participated in that conference, so you can see who was there. But one of our recommendations in the report is that intergovernmental relations with Indigenous nations have to become much more formalized going forward, and that we should stop treating Indigenous partners, communities, nations as stakeholders, especially when you're dealing with these kinds of crises. So what we heard at our conference last year from some Indigenous participants was often they were being invited to tables, decision-making tables, for the first time. In the context of an emergency, yes, but we would hope that going forward, there would be more meaningful consultation with Indigenous nations, Indigenous leaders in these types of situations. And we are also urging the federal government to follow through with the implementation of its framework for UNDRIP, which inside that framework talks about including Indigenous nations meaningfully in decision-making. So it was very much part of our report, and we hope you'll read it.
Follow-up, Fraser?
I'm that's fine, thanks.
We have more questions in the room? No? This concludes the press conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
This is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is mine.
Michelle?
Thank you. This is all mixed up. Yeah, I have yours too.